And I need to check Blackboard and see if this version is on Blackboard or not. All right? So we're not going to have time to cover everything in this PowerPoint, but that's what you're responsible for. So what you need to ignore, right? Ignore women and exercise, children and exercise, older adults. Ignore HIV, epilepsy, hypertension, low back pain, cognitive disorders. Okay?
Wait, so that means we don't have to stress about it, or we have to look at it?
No, ignore us.
Hypertension.
Yes. Ignore women. Ignore children. Ignore older adults. Ignore the HIV/AIDS and the epilepsy and the hypertension, because we've talked a lot about hypertension and exercise. So, and then with ADHD is in the PowerPoint. Ignore low back pain and ignore cognitive disorders. I think they cover Down syndrome. Can't remember what else under there. All right, so just cover the stuff that is in chapter 16 short. Okay, and remind me to check whether or not that spreadsheet is, that PowerPoint is up there. Okay. All right, so I'm going to skip asthma because I really, really want to go over diabetes with you. So if I have time, I'll come back. But it's really important that you understand the differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So I want to spend time on that since we've only got the one lecture. Okay? All right, so what we call diabetes is technically diabetes mellitus, and that stands for the inability to maintain your blood glucose levels at a normal range, right? So within what would be considered healthy. What that means then is that your body can't take carbohydrate out from the bloodstream and store it in the tissue for later use. So people who have diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, have very high blood glucose levels because the ability to transport the carbohydrate out of the bloodstream is depressed. Okay. So diabetes, in particular type 2, is a really big problem. It's getting worse. The number of people who suffer with diabetes or are being diagnosed as pre-diabetic now is on the rise. And as you can see, it's just about doubled since 1980, and it is costing a huge amount of money for insurance companies and therefore for us, because anything the insurance company gets charged gets passed on, right? The premiums go up every year, and what you get for your premiums goes down every year, right? So the big problem with diabetes is that that increases your risk for many other forms of diseases, right? So heart disease and stroke, hypertension. People with diabetes often go blind because of the additional sugar wrecks the visual nerve. They quite often develop peripheral neuropathy, and that can lead to gangrene because they get ulcers and they don't know they've got ulcers because the nerves aren't sending the proper pain signals and things, and so then the ulcer develops gangrene. 60% or more of the amputations in America are not caused by trauma, by an accident. They're caused by things like diabetes and neuropathy. So that's a large number of amputations that are occurring because of something that is majority lifestyle oriented, right? So we'll talk about the one that isn't lifestyle oriented first of all. Type 1 diabetes is also called insulin dependent diabetes. It's only about 10 to 15% of the people who are diabetic are type 1. Type 1 is genetically determined, okay? And what happens in type 1 is that your pancreas, the beta cells on your pancreas are not working correctly. And so they're responsible for producing insulin, and so what happens is that either you don't produce any insulin at all, or you only produce very, very low levels, and therefore you have to have exogenous insulin. So a type 1 diabetic will take insulin jabs and will learn how to inject themselves, okay? They might have an insulin pump these days. They're getting cleverer with how to do this. So what happens, insulin is the transporter for blood glucose into the tissues. So without insulin available, that blood glucose just builds up and up and up in the bloodstream. Okay. So then when they take their insulin shot, you see a quite rapid drop in blood glucose levels because all that blood glucose can jump out of the bloodstream and into the muscle tissue or the liver or wherever it's going to get stored. Okay. So around meal times means that they will have to have a shot somewhere around meal time so that the carbohydrate they're eating with the meal can be moved out of the bloodstream and stored. They also have to plan the carbohydrate intake very carefully across the whole day because it doesn't do its usual kind of steady state. It goes up and down based on the shot, so they have to kind of be very careful about planning that out. Okay? Symptoms for type 1, excessive urine production, which you should recognize, right? Sugar in the urine, you probably wouldn't know. You might be able to, it might smell really sweet, but ketones can do that as well. So you wouldn't know that unless it was tested. Being thirsty. So that's quite a good one to keep an eye out with children, the thirst and the excess urine production, because type 1 can exhibit itself really at any age. It's usually around 9, 10, 11 that it starts to exhibit, but it can come out earlier than that because it's genetically driven. Okay? So, from our point of view, what we need to know is how do I train if I'm a type 1 diabetic, or if I have a client or an athlete or a student who's a type 1 diabetic. All right. So, first thing is, does this person have any other complications? Because if they do, exercise may not be the right move for them at that time, right? They need to have their blood glucose levels under good control. When you have type 1 diabetes, exercising regularly might improve your blood glucose control, but it typically doesn't. Alright, so it's not like if I'm a type 1 and I exercise every day, I don't have to take my insulin shot. That's not how it works. Okay? But they still get all the other benefits from exercising on a regular basis. So it's still going to help them counter cardiovascular disease and becoming overweight and other issues. Okay? Now, you have to be very careful with the insulin shot and the exercise session, all right? Because if they take their insulin shot just before they exercise, they're going to have a big drop in blood glucose and become hypoglycemic within a short period of the exercise session, all right? So they may have to move their insulin dose to another time, or they may need to reduce their insulin dose if they have to take it before the exercise session. Okay. And you want to be very careful about this peripheral neuropathy idea. Make sure that their shoes fit well, that their socks fit well. Keep reminding them to check their feet during the exercise session. Are their socks rubbing? Because they might not feel it, right? So they don't know that they're getting a blister. So you have to keep reminding them. You have to check all the time that their shoes and their socks fit well and that they're not developing blisters, right? So exercise is still beneficial to their health, but it's not likely to improve their disease state. Yes?
Is type 1 the type where they have to like get that shot and like put it on that strip? That's
Yeah.
type 1?
Yeah. Well, actually both of them do, because that prick and the little piece of like blotting paper test their blood sugar levels. So both have to do that. And they're really clever, those machines now. You just get a tiny little finger prick, drop a piece of blood, stick it in the machine, and it will read your blood glucose levels. My sister is type 2 and she has to do that as well.
Okay.
So I think that that's a useful tool for both types, because this idea of trying to maintain blood sugar levels as stable as possible, which isn't easy, is important. All right, so if we do aerobic work of a moderate intensity, that works almost like insulin, right? The contraction, relaxation, this repetitive muscle contraction encourages the movement of sugar from the bloodstream into the muscle tissue. So it will increase the risk of hypoglycemia on top of their shot if they took their shot ahead of the exercise. Right? So we want to drop their insulin dosage down, make sure that they've had some carbohydrate, make sure they have carbohydrate with them, or that you have carbohydrate in case they get a hypo attack. Right? So it's always important, if you're working with a type 1, that you've got a banana or some raisins or something in your bag that you can give them an immediate sugar hit if they need it. Right? Because you don't want them, a type 1 can drop blood sugar levels very, very quickly, and then before you know it, you have someone who's in a coma. Right? And that's scary to have to deal with. Okay? If we're doing high intensity, kind of short duration, then that increases glucose production from the liver. Right? And so that will increase their blood sugar levels. Okay? So that means that Post-exercise, they might need an additional little shot of insulin to deal with the increased levels of glucose from the exercise session, all right, and restrict their carbohydrate intake. So it's very different depending on what type of activity you're doing with them as to whether or not they need to have additional carbs or less carbs, right? Do they need less insulin or a little bit more insulin, right? The research on intermittent type exercise, so like a soccer game or a basketball game or playing racquetball or tennis, something that's stop, start, there's not a lot of research on that type of activity at the moment. The little bit there is suggests that you might not need to worry too much because of the type of exercise, but I think if it's, you know, I always think if it's a type 1 person, you just need to keep your eyes on them all the time. If they are getting hypoglycemic, then they might exhibit some confusion. You know, they might not understand the instructions that you're giving them. You might see some loss in coordination of their movement. All right, so those, you want to keep an eye out for those. Try to catch it before they lose consciousness, because then it's a whole difficult. Okay, so type 1 diabetes then, exercise is beneficial to their overall health, but it's not likely to change their type 1 diabetes. Can't cure type 1 diabetes, it's genetic, okay? So type 2 is a whole different ballgame, all right? Because type 2 may have a small underlying genetic component, or it may have nothing to do with genetics. It can be completely lifestyle dependent, right? So type 2 is called non-insulin dependent because in type 2 there's nothing wrong with the pancreas. The pancreas is producing insulin just fine. The problem occurs because with type 2, the person has developed decreased sensitivity at the membrane to the insulin. So the insulin is there, but because of the sensitivity levels of the membrane, there isn't enough of it to move the glucose into the muscle tissue. So we need more than the normal amount of insulin to overcome the sensitivity of the muscle membrane. So type 2 diabetes is the vast number of diabetics, right? Almost all the diabetics you come across in your career, and you're going to come across a lot because the numbers are rising. So unless you only work with competitive athletes, the chances are you're going to have to deal with people with diabetes, okay? It's really, really important that you find out ahead of time if they're a type 1. Just knowing they're diabetic is not enough, right? You have to know whether they're a type 1 or a type 2. So risk factors for type 2, obesity, which we know is on the rise, okay, lack of exercise, which we know is a big problem, sedentary behavior, age, although I think, in fairness, the age is more linked to the fact that as we get older, we become more sedentary and we put on weight, and right, and so all those factors start to play in. If you stay healthy and you stay active, it's unlikely you would develop type 2 diabetes, unless you have a really unlucky genetic profile, right? And unfortunately, ethnicities. So Native Americans, African Americans, people with a Hispanic background are all at more risk than Caucasians. Okay. Remember what, yes, sir?
If you're type 2 and you're diagnosed, can you like get out of it or get rid of it?
If you're diagnosed early enough and if you work hard enough. So if you're pre-diabetic, and I'll come to that in a minute, if you're pre-diabetic and you are willing to change your lifestyle, you can prevent yourself developing full-blown type 2 diabetes. If you have early stage type 2 diabetes, you can control it, and some people have been able to basically get rid of it, cure it. If you have more developed type 2 diabetes, you can control it pretty well. Some type 2 diabetics never have to take insulin. You can control it with diet and exercise and maybe one other drug. Right? If you remember back when we were doing body composition and things, and we were talking about the difference between pear-shaped and apple-shaped, and we said that that visceral fat here has a higher risk factor associated with it than subcutaneous fat. This is one of the reasons why, right? Because visceral fat releases these pro-inflammatory substances that destroy the beta cells in the pancreas. So then you've got pancreas that should be working and producing insulin properly being attacked, and now it can't produce insulin properly. Right? So that visceral obesity has a much, much higher risk for many reasons, but that's one reason. Right? Type 2 used to be called adult onset diabetes because you didn't really see children get it. It was when adults, went to work and started eating and becoming sedentary, and then they developed type 2 diabetes in their 40s. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing large numbers of children, in their pre-puberty are showing like the first signs, and we've got teenagers developing full-blown type 2 diabetes now. So it really is a problem for the community as a whole, yeah.
Are these children usually obese or?
Yeah, obese, sedentary. Those of you that are on the playground, Jason, Mateo, they're doomed. Doomed. But, yeah. Sex isn't a risk factor. Typically, young girls appear to be more prone than young boys, probably because of the amount of fat cells that are laid down during puberty, and then they're also more likely to be sedentary, and so we see a few more kind of teenage girls developing than teenage boys. So here's a frustration with type 2 diabetes. I mean, this is seriously on epidemic proportions. I mean, the number of people being diagnosed with type 2 is going through the roof. And a large number of these people have risk factors that are lifestyle dictated, and therefore they're controllable, right? So the adipose tissue releases fatty acids. Those fatty acids travel in the bloodstream to the liver and the muscle, and the fatty acids blunt the sensitivity of the membrane. Right? So this seems amazing to me, but this is what the research tells us, is that if we lose 7% of our fat mass, then we see a 50% improvement in insulin sensitivity. That's huge. That means I don't even have to persuade this person to get thin and skinny. We just have to get them a bit more healthy. And the payback is massive. Okay? And the lack of physical activity. So these two things together, you know, we talked about the fact that obesity isn't as simple as just too much overeating and not enough exercising. There are some other factors involved here. But if I can control it a little bit and add some physical activity. So as I said, the muscle contraction recruits these transporters that move glucose. It's not the same as insulin, but it's similar to insulin. So it recruits transporters in the membrane that help to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into the working muscle. Not just during the exercise session, but for a period of time after the exercise session. Right? So the impact of the exercise on their glucose management can last for several hours. Okay? So the more regularly we train, the more physical activity we do, the more likely we are going to be able to manage our blood glucose without having to resort to taking insulin. A lot of the times you will see resources say, oh, this exercise has to be aerobic. And it does seem that aerobic has a longer benefit post-exercise, but resistance training also helps. And that's good to know, because if we're looking at a holistic health program, then that person shouldn't only be doing aerobics and no resistance work. Right? Okay, so many benefits. Things that we can do to help someone who has developed type 2 diabetes, or as I said, is pre-diabetic, because now we have this additional category, kind of like the pre-hypertension category. They've developed a pre-diabetic category to try to pinpoint, to pick out the people who are at risk before it gets too far. So, unlike type 1, which is unlikely to change with exercise, type 2 diabetes responds really well. All right? Add to the fact that it reduces hypertension, it helps with body composition, right? And so, someone who is type 2 and exercises regularly, they estimate could decrease their risk of death from complications of diabetes or cardiovascular disease by 50% or more. To me, that statistic alone ought to be enough to motivate someone with type 2 diabetes to move. Right? But you have to remember that they developed type 2 diabetes probably because of a sedentary lifestyle, and now you're trying to get them to become someone who exercises on a regular basis. It's a big lifestyle change, and people aren't very good at that. So tackle it little bit by little bit. Right? Don't expect them to go from doing nothing to doing everything. A little bit at a time. Chip away at the habits, right? Make it a twice-a-week habit, then make it a 3-day-a-week habit, then make it a 4-day-a-week habit, then maybe start doing something with the diet and chip away at that. Right? You can only tackle little bits at a time if you want people to stick with it. Right? Let's see, we talked about most of this. So aerobic exercise should be every 2 days minimum to maintain the benefits to the blood glucose transport. If you have someone who has developed neuropathy, all right? So that means that the nerves in their feet, their ankles, their lower limbs are not working properly. Their brain is not getting quality information from those sensory receptors. Then you may want to use swimming and cycling rather than walking or jogging or some other kind of weight-bearing exercise. The problem with that then is that you're not tackling bone health, right? Because swimming and cycling will do heart health, but they won't do anything for your bones because they're not weight-bearing. But you also don't want to put someone at risk of falling over and getting hurt because they can't feel when they're off balance very well, right? So there's some recommendations on where to start. All right, our 10 to 15 minutes is below our minimum on our fit chart, right? So this is one of those times where you're going to go, I've got to get this person healthy enough to be able to use my fit ranges, right? So I have to start below the minimum level and build up to that. Maybe. You might not have to. Depends what level, you know, where they are when you get them. So the ACSM recommends twice a week for resistance work. The ADA recommends 3 times a week, so it depends where you're looking. The big picture is try to get a nice balanced aerobic and resistance program. Okay, then we have like diabetes on steroids. Right? Metabolic syndrome. In Europe, it's known as Syndrome X. Over here, it's called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is an umbrella term for a group of diseases that are often seen together. Okay? So obesity, hypertension, poor lipid profiles, so our LDLs versus our HDLs, right? And insulin resistance. Okay. So if I have all 4 of those disease states going on, then I might be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And that's pretty scary because we see much higher risk levels then for full-blown type 2 diabetes, death from cardiovascular disease, strokes, heart attacks. And we're up to nearly 1/4 of Americans, they estimate, that would clinically be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome if they went and got checked. Okay? So that's the estimate. So, again, risk factors, similar. Okay, obesity, insulin resistance, which might be caused by your obesity, inactivity, which is probably feeding into your obesity, age might play a role, diet, which could also be feeding into your obesity, particularly if you're eating a high-carb diet. So, the guidelines recommend that we follow the same kind of plan that we would for cardiovascular disease here. We want to try to reduce weight, or, you know, and we hopefully by now you all know that by weight I mean fat mass. Okay. We want to use moderate intensity endurance exercise for longer than 30 minutes. Once they're healthy enough to do that amount of work. All right, so remember we've got to tie together all the principles for fat loss. All right, the crossover between carbs and fats is about 20 minutes. Right? So I need to be exercising for longer than 20 minutes to utilize fat stores. Okay? We know from the fat max zone that we want to work between 68 and 79% of our max heart rate, something like that, right? If I work too hard, I'm going to be hitting carbohydrate, not fat. If I work too low, I'm going to be using fat, but not enough of it to make a difference, right? So we've got intensity, we've got duration, we've got all these principles that we have to use, we have to tie them all together, and then we've got to look at our energy balance, right? Can I drop my energy balance and get a deficit of at least 500 calories a day? Okay? Between adding a bit of activity and decreasing a little bit of calorie intake. If I can create a 1,000 calorie deficit, that would be great, but that's a big lifestyle change for someone like this, so I would aim for 500, and then you can increase it. Right? We want to restrict some carbs, particularly simple carbs, right? The sugars, the fruit juices, the candy, the sodas. Right? Make sure that the carbs that they're eating are complex carbohydrates that are going to drip feed the bloodstream slowly. It's this population that things like higher protein diets and stuff like that were really originally developed for. Okay, not for athletes. Okay. And then we want, we want our aerobic work, we want our resistance work, we want some flexibility, we want our neuromotor. Just like we would on our fit chart, we may just have to start below the minimum for this individual. So this data is a little out of date. The last lot I saw was 2016, and we're up around 19%, I think. So the purple is 2 to 5-year-olds, the red is 6 to 11, the orange is 12 to 19. So you can see why we're starting to see type 2 diabetes in such a young population. Okay. I think New Mexico is at 6-year-olds are at like 30% overweight obesity levels in this state. So it's pretty bad. When you look at the average, you've got to remember there are states that have children that are healthy as opposed to Alabama, Louisiana, New Mexico. Okay. What else about the children? Let me think. Just to get on my soapbox for a minute, right? This picture is why, depending on what you go out and do for a job, you might want to consider volunteering once or twice a month at a recreation center or a preschool and try to encourage physical activity in those children, right? Because we're clearly not getting enough physical activity in school. We need better PE teachers, we need people voting to fund schools so that schools don't cut PE because they need the funds somewhere else in the school, right? We need to promote PE and physical activity within our communities as much as possible because this picture is getting worse. And the problem is, even when it's stabilizing, the obesity levels within the stable overall number are going up. Right? So everybody will go, oh yeah, we've stabilized at 30%. And we're supposed to be glad about that because we stabilized. What they don't say is, of the 30%, now 12% are obese, where only 8% were obese the last time. Right? And I wanted to just give you a little bit of additional information because this is so disturbing. The ACSM are pretty good at producing interesting reports that are not sport-based all the time. And they produced this report. I've had this a couple of years now, so it's been around for a while. Doesn't seem to be having any impact on what we're doing in our schools. But the International Diabetes Foundation decided that they needed to look at overweight, obesity, and the link with disease in 2005, something like that. 2007, they decided that we can't identify metabolic syndrome in children under 10. Well, good. Okay. However, there's a pre-culture for the development of the syndrome that can be identified. So children under 10 are eating too many calories. They are too sedentary, right? So we might not be able to clinically identify metabolic syndrome in 10 and under, but we know that the way they're behaving is indicative of metabolic syndrome, right? 10 to 16, they came up with a definition of metabolic syndrome. So the clustering of any three of the following: obesity with a waist circumference greater than or equal to 90% based on their age and gender. Triglycerides that are equal to or higher than 150 milligrams per deciliter. HDLs that are less than 40 milligrams per deciliter. Systolic blood pressure equal to or higher than 130. Okay, remember Remember, 100, less than 120 is healthy. Diastolic blood pressure that is equal to or higher than 85, and glucose that is equal to or higher than 100 milligrams per deciliter. So things are so bad, they've actually had to clinically define metabolic syndrome for 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. 16 and above are counted as adults. That's appalling. That is appalling. And you guys are going to go out and work in it, so do something about it. Because it's getting worse. And from a purely selfish point of view, your insurance premiums are going to probably cost more than your mortgage before you die. Horrible, horrible. Okay, so look at the rest of the notes within that PowerPoint. Tie them back to the additional detail in the chapter. Anything that isn't in the PowerPoint, ignore in the chapter. Okay? Friday, review. Monday, exam.
Isn't this